The sound of the lock clicking shut behind me was the cruelest sound I had ever heard. There I was, standing in my own bedroom, wearing my black dress and pearl necklace that Harold had given me for our 40th anniversary, ready to say goodbye to my husband of 45 years. And my own son, Michael, had just imprisoned me like a common criminal. "It's just a stupid ceremony," he had shouted through the door, his voice echoing in the hallway of the home where I had raised him with love and dedication. Can you imagine being prevented by your own child from attending your life partner's funeral? What would you do if the person you gave everything to decided you were no longer worthy of basic human dignity? I remained silent in that room, listening to the cars starting outside, watching through the window as my family left for Harold's funeral without me. But I already knew that what would happen in the following days would change the course of our family forever, and that Michael had just made the biggest mistake of his life. My name is Penelope Harrington. I am 68 years old, and until last week I was simply a devoted wife and mother who had dedicated her entire life to her family. For 4 decades, I worked as a corporate attorney, building a solid reputation and helping Harold expand his construction business into an empire worth millions. I retired 5 years ago to take care of Harold when his health began to decline, but my legal mind never stopped working. What Michael didn't know, what none of them knew, was that while they saw me as a fragile old woman to be manipulated and controlled, I was still the same lawyer who had never lost a case involving family inheritance disputes, the same woman who had taught courses on estate planning at the university, the same person who knew every legal loophole and had spent years preparing for exactly this kind of situation. The funeral was on a Tuesday morning in October. Harold had passed away the previous Friday after a long battle with cancer, and during those final days, I had noticed subtle changes in Michael's behavior. He had started talking about practical decisions and what's best for everyone. He brought his wife Jennifer to the house more frequently, and both of them looked at me with a mixture of pity and impatience that made my skin crawl. On Monday night, the night before the funeral, Michael came to my room with an expression I had never seen before. It was the look of someone who had already made a decision and wasn't going to be dissuaded. "Mom, I think it would be better if you didn't go to Dad's funeral tomorrow," he said, sitting on the edge of my bed as if he were talking to a child. "You've been very emotional lately, and we don't want you to have a breakdown in public. It would be embarrassing for the family." Embarrassing for the family. Those words echoed in my mind like a slap. I, who had built that family's reputation and wealth alongside Harold, was now considered an embarrassment. But I maintained my composure and simply said I would be ready at 9 in the morning, as planned. That's when I saw the flash of anger in his eyes, the same look he used to have as a child when he didn't get his way. The next morning, I was ready exactly at 9 o'clock. I had chosen my black dress carefully, the one Harold always said made me look elegant. I had put on my pearl necklace and the wedding ring that had never left my finger in 45 years. I was prepared to say goodbye to the love of my life with the dignity he deserved. That's when Michael appeared in the hallway with a grim expression. "I told you that you're not going," he said firmly. "Jennifer is already in the car with the kids, and we don't have room for drama today." When I tried to walk past him toward the door, he physically blocked my path. "You're staying here, Mom. It's for your own good." The discussion that followed was brief but revealing. Michael made it clear that he considered me mentally incompetent to make my own decisions. He talked about how I had been confused since Harold's death, how I needed professional help to deal with my grief. Every word was carefully chosen, and I realized he had been preparing this narrative for weeks. When I insisted on leaving, he pushed me back into the bedroom and locked the door from the outside. "It's just a stupid ceremony," he shouted through the wood. "Dad is already dead. This theater won't bring him back." The contempt in his voice was unmistakable. This wasn't about protecting me from emotional pain. This was about control. As I sat on the edge of my bed, listening to the sounds of the family leaving without me, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: absolute clarity. All those months of subtle manipulation, all those conversations about what would be best for me, all those looks of impatience when I expressed my own opinions, everything finally made sense. They weren't protecting me, they were isolating me. And that lock clicking shut wasn't the sound of care. It was the sound of a trap closing around me. But what Michael didn't know was that he had just locked himself in with the wrong person. He had underestimated the woman who had spent 4 decades fighting legal battles and winning every single one of them. As I watched the funeral procession leave through my bedroom window, I wasn't thinking about my grief or my humiliation. I was thinking about something Harold had told me years ago when we were planning our estate. Penny, never let anyone think they can control you just because you're getting older. Your mind is your greatest weapon, and it only gets sharper with time. That Tuesday morning, locked in my own bedroom while my husband was being buried without me, I began to plan something that would change everything. Because sometimes, when someone tries to bury you, they don't realize they're just planting the seeds of their own destruction. They returned from the funeral 3 hours later, and I could hear their voices downstairs, casual, almost cheerful, as if they had just returned from a pleasant social gathering rather than burying the patriarch of our family. I remained in my room, not because the door was still locked, but because I had decided to let them think they had complete control over me. Sometimes the best strategy is to let your opponents believe they're winning while you gather intelligence. Jennifer's laugh echoed up the stairs, sharp and brittle. She was telling someone on the phone about how well everything went and how peaceful it had been. Peaceful. My husband's funeral had been peaceful because his wife of 45 years hadn't been there to mourn him. The irony was so bitter, I could taste it. Around noon, Michael finally unlocked my door. He entered without knocking, carrying a tray with a sandwich and tea, as if I were an invalid who needed to be fed. "How are you feeling, Mom?" he asked, with that patronizing tone that had become his default way of speaking to me. "I know today was difficult, but you'll thank me later for sparing you from all that stress." I looked at him carefully, really looked at him, perhaps for the first time in years. When had my son become this person? When had the boy I had taught to ride a bicycle and helped with homework transformed into this cold, calculating man who spoke to me as if I were mentally deficient? "Tell me about the funeral," I said simply. "It was beautiful," he replied, but there was something in his eyes that didn't match his words. Very dignified. Lots of people came to pay their respects. Dad would have been proud. He paused, and I caught something flickering across his face. A micro-expression that my years as a lawyer had taught me to recognize. Guilt mixed with excitement. The look of someone who had just received unexpected good news at an inappropriate time. "Were there many people from his business?" I asked, keeping my voice neutral and slightly vacant, as if I were just making conversation to fill the silence. This was a technique I had learned in court. Let the opposing party think you're not paying attention while you gather crucial information. "Oh yes, lots of them. His partners, some of the major clients." Michael sat down in the chair by my window, and I noticed he seemed more relaxed now, more talkative than he had been in weeks. "Actually, Mom, we need to talk about some practical things. Dad's business partners approached me today after the service." There it was, the first crack in the facade. I had been wondering when this conversation would come, and now I understood why Michael had been so eager to keep me away from the funeral. It wasn't about protecting my emotional state. It was about having private conversations without my interference. "They're concerned about the future of the company," he continued, studying my face for any reaction. "With Dad gone, there are a lot of decisions that need to be made quickly. Legal decisions, financial decisions. They need someone who can step in immediately and handle things." I nodded slowly, playing the role of the confused widow who didn't understand business matters. "That sounds very complicated," I said softly. "I suppose you'll help them find the right person for that." Michael's smile was almost predatory. "Well, actually, Mom, I've been thinking about this for a while. Jennifer and I have discussed it extensively. We think the best solution would be for me to take over Dad's role in the company. I have the business background, I understand the industry, and most importantly, I have the family's best interests at heart." The family's best interests. Those words again. I was beginning to understand that whenever Michael used that phrase, he meant his own interests. "But don't you already have your own marketing company?" I asked innocently. "Yes, but this is different. This is Dad's legacy we're talking about. This is about preserving what he built for future generations." He leaned forward, his voice taking on that persuasive tone I remembered from his childhood when he wanted something. "The thing is, Mom, for this to work properly, there need to be some legal changes. Some transfers of ownership and decision-making authority. There it was, the real reason for everything. The lock on my door, the exclusion from the funeral, the sudden concern for my mental health. It was all leading to this moment. Michael wanted to take control of Harold's business empire, and he needed me out of the way to do it. "I don't understand these things," I said, allowing a tremor to enter my voice. "Harold always handled all the business matters. I never paid attention to any of it." This was, of course, a complete lie. I had been intimately involved in every major decision Harold had made for the past 4 decades. I had structured most of the legal framework of his business operations, but Michael didn't need to know that yet. "Exactly," he said, his excitement barely contained now. "That's why it's so important to have someone who understands these matters handling things, someone the business partners trust and respect." He paused, and I could almost see the wheels turning in his head. "There are some papers that need to be signed. Nothing complicated, just some standard legal documents that will make the transition smoother. Papers that needed to be signed." My lawyer's instincts were screaming at me now. In 40 years of practice, I had seen this scenario countless times. Family members swooping in after a death to convince grieving widows to sign documents they didn't understand, transferring control of assets worth millions to people who had no legal right to them. "When would this need to happen?" I asked, maintaining my confused, helpless demeanor. "Soon," he said quickly. "Business doesn't wait for grief, Mom. Dad's partners need certainty. His clients need to know who they'll be working with going forward. Every day we delay costs the family money. The family, always the family. Never you, never your inheritance, never acknowledgement that everything Michael was talking about legally belonged to me as Harold's widow. Everything was being framed as if I were simply an obstacle to be managed rather than the rightful owner of my deceased husband's estate. "I suppose I should call our lawyer," I said thoughtfully. "Harold always said that Mr. Peterson should handle any important papers." The change in Michael's expression was instantaneous and telling. His face darkened, and for a moment, the mask slipped completely. "Mom, I don't think that's necessary. Mr. Peterson is getting old, and he's not really familiar with business matters. I've already consulted with a specialist who understands these types of situations much better. A specialist who understands these types of situations. In other words, a lawyer who would be working for Michael's interests, not mine. A lawyer who would draft documents designed to transfer control of Harold's assets to my son, while making it appear as if it were all for my own good. But Harold trusted Mr. Peterson," I said weakly. "They worked together for 20 years. Mom, you're not thinking clearly." Michael's patience was beginning to wear thin, and his true personality was starting to show through. "This is exactly why you shouldn't be making these kinds of decisions right now. You're emotional, you're confused, and you're not capable of understanding the complexities involved. Not capable of understanding the complexities." The man was talking to a woman who had spent 4 decades handling complex legal cases, who had helped build the very business empire he was now trying to steal, who had graduated summa cum laude from Harvard Law School when women in law were still a rarity. But I just nodded sadly and said, "You're probably right. I just feel so lost without Harold. I don't know what to do about anything anymore." "That's exactly why you need to trust me," Michael said, his voice softening again as he sensed victory. "Jennifer and I will take care of everything. You won't have to worry about any of these complicated matters. We'll handle the business, the legal issues, all of it. You can just focus on taking care of yourself and healing from your grief. Taking care of myself while they took care of my money." The picture was becoming clearer by the minute. But what Michael didn't realize was that every word he had just spoken had been a gift to me. He had revealed his entire strategy, his timeline, and most importantly, his assumption that I was completely helpless and ignorant. As he left my room that evening, promising to bring the simple papers for me to sign the next day, I sat by my window and watched the sunset paint the sky the color of warning. Michael thought he had me trapped, thought he had successfully isolated me and broken my spirit. He thought the hard part was over. He was about to learn that he had made the most dangerous mistake possible. He had underestimated his opponent. And in the game he had chosen to play, that mistake would cost him everything. Tomorrow, the real game would begin. Wednesday morning arrived with the kind of crisp autumn air that Harold used to love. I woke up before dawn, as I had every day for the past 40 years, but this time I didn't spend those quiet morning hours thinking about my grief. Instead, I spent them thinking like the lawyer I had always been, the lawyer I had never stopped being, even when the world tried to convince me that I was just a helpless old woman. The first thing I did was retrieve something Michael didn't know existed. A small key hidden inside my jewelry box, behind a false back that Harold had installed years ago. The key opened a safety deposit box at First National Bank, a box that contained copies of every important document related to our estate, our business holdings, and most importantly, our wills. You see, when you've spent 4 decades as an attorney specializing in family law and estate planning, you don't just write a simple will and forget about it. You create a comprehensive legal fortress designed to protect against exactly the kind of situation I now found myself in. Harold and I had updated our documents every 2 years, always staying ahead of changes in the law, always preparing for contingencies that most people never consider. While Michael was downstairs making his phone calls and probably celebrating his anticipated victory, I was methodically reviewing documents that would soon turn his world upside down. The irony was exquisite. My son was planning to steal an inheritance using legal maneuvers against the very person who had invented half of those maneuvers. Around 9 o'clock, I heard Jennifer arrive. Her voice carried up the stairs, bright and excited, discussing the papers with Michael. They were talking about me as if I weren't even in the house, referring to me as she and her, with the casual dismissiveness people use when discussing a problem that needs to be solved. "Is she going to cooperate?" Jennifer asked. "Oh yes," Michael replied confidently. "She's completely out of her depth. Yesterday she was talking about calling Peterson, but I shut that down quickly. She doesn't understand anything about business or legal matters. Never has. Never has." The statement was so absurd it was almost funny. I was the person who had structured the legal framework for Harold's entire business empire. I was the one who had negotiated the contracts that made our family wealthy. I was the one who had taught business law at the university level. But Michael had never paid attention to any of that, had never asked about my work, had never shown the slightest interest in what his mother did for a living. In his mind, I had always just been Mom, the person who made dinner and did laundry and attended school plays. The fact that I also happened to be one of the most respected estate attorneys in the state was apparently invisible to him. At 10 o'clock, Michael knocked on my door. "Mom, the lawyer is here. Are you ready to take care of these papers?" I opened the door, wearing my most confused, vulnerable expression. "I suppose so," I said softly. "I just want to do whatever Harold would have wanted." The lawyer was a young man in his 30s, expensively dressed, but with the slightly predatory look of someone who specialized in taking advantage of vulnerable people in emotional situations. His name was Bradley Morrison, and I recognized the type immediately. The kind of attorney who gave our profession a bad reputation. "Mrs. Harrington," he said with practiced sympathy, "please accept my condolences on your loss. I know this must be a very difficult time for you." "Thank you," I replied, allowing my voice to shake slightly. "I still can't believe Harold is gone." Of course. That's exactly why we want to make this as simple as possible for you. Michael has explained the situation, and I've prepared some straightforward documents that will ensure Harold's business interests are properly managed during this transition period. Transition period. The euphemisms these people used were almost artistic in their deception. This wasn't a transition period. This was a permanent transfer of control over assets worth millions of dollars. Morrison spread the documents across my dining room table with the confidence of a man who had done this many times before. As you can see, these are very standard forms. Nothing complicated. Just some paperwork that will allow Michael to handle the day-to-day business decisions while you focus on your recovery. I looked at the papers with what I hoped appeared to be bewilderment, but my trained eye was rapidly scanning the legal language. What I saw made my blood run cold, and also filled me with a kind of professional admiration for the audacity of the scheme. The documents were brilliantly crafted pieces of legal theft. On the surface, they appeared to be temporary power of attorney forms, giving Michael authority to handle business matters on my behalf. But buried in the complex legal language were clauses that would give him permanent control over not just the business, but virtually all of our family assets. There were provisions for him to sell properties, transfer funds, even commit me to a care facility if he deemed it necessary for my health and safety. I don't understand most of this, I said honestly, because while I understood it perfectly, I needed them to believe I didn't. That's perfectly normal, Morrison said smoothly. Legal documents can be confusing for people who aren't familiar with the terminology. The important thing to understand is that this protects you. It ensures that Harold's business continues to provide for you while removing the burden of complex financial decisions from your shoulders. Michael was watching me carefully, and I could see the anticipation in his eyes. He was so close to getting everything he wanted. All he needed was my signature on a few pieces of paper. "Where do I sign?" I asked weakly. The relief that washed over Michael's face was almost palpable. Morrison began pointing to signature lines, explaining each one with the kind of reassuring patter that was designed to prevent people from thinking too carefully about what they were agreeing to. But just as I was about to pick up the pen, I paused. "I'm sorry," I said, looking up at them with confusion. "I just realized, shouldn't I read this more carefully? Harold always said never to sign anything without reading it thoroughly." Morrison's smile became slightly strained. "Mrs. Harrington, I understand your caution, but these really are standard documents. Michael has already reviewed everything, and he has your best interests at heart. Sometimes overthinking these things just creates unnecessary anxiety." "But Harold always said," I began again. "Mom," Michael interrupted, and there was an edge to his voice now. "Harold isn't here anymore. You need to start making your own decisions, and right now, the best decision is to trust the people who care about you. Trust the people who care about you." The manipulation was so transparent, it was almost insulting. But I played my role perfectly, nodding uncertainly and reaching for the pen again. That's when I made my first move. "You know," I said thoughtfully, "maybe I should call Harold's old friend Judge Morrison. No relation, I assume?" I looked at the lawyer with innocent curiosity. "Judge Morrison has known our family for 30 years. Harold always said that if I ever needed legal advice and he wasn't around, Judge Morrison would help me understand things." The young lawyer's face went pale. Judge Morrison was indeed no relation, and he was also the most respected family court judge in the county, known for his fierce protection of elderly people's rights and his harsh sentences for anyone caught taking advantage of vulnerable seniors. "I don't think that's necessary," Morrison said quickly. "Really, Mrs. Harrington, we're just trying to help you avoid unnecessary complications." But I was already reaching for the phone. "Oh, it won't be any trouble. Judge Morrison told me to call him any time. Let me just—" I started dialing. "Mom, stop." Michael's voice had gone from persuasive to commanding. "You're being ridiculous. These papers need to be signed today. The business can't wait while you call every person Dad ever knew." I looked at him with hurt in my eyes. "I just want to make sure I'm doing the right thing. Is that so wrong?" The tension in the room was electric. Morrison was gathering his papers, clearly wanting to leave before this situation got completely out of his control. Michael was caught between his desire to maintain his caring son facade and his growing frustration at seeing his plan threatened. "Perhaps," Morrison said carefully, "we should give Mrs. Harrington some time to think about this. We can come back tomorrow when she's had a chance to process everything." "No," Michael said firmly. "We're finishing this today." And in that moment, his mask slipped completely. The caring, protective son disappeared, and what remained was a man who had made up his mind to take what he wanted, regardless of anyone else's wishes. I had seen exactly what I needed to see. Michael wasn't just trying to manipulate me. He was desperate, and desperate people make mistakes. "I think I need some air," I said, standing up unsteadily. "This is all so overwhelming." As I walked toward the back door, I heard Michael and Morrison arguing in hushed voices behind me. The young lawyer wanted to retreat and try again later with a different strategy. Michael wanted to push forward immediately. But what neither of them knew was that while they had been focused on me, I had already begun implementing a plan of my own. The phone call to Judge Morrison hadn't been a stalling tactic. It had been a signal. A signal that would set in motion a series of events that would soon turn hunters into prey. Standing in my garden, breathing the crisp autumn air and looking at the roses Harold had planted for me 20 years ago, I smiled for the first time since his death. Michael thought he was playing chess, but he had just discovered he was actually in a match with a grandmaster. The game was about to change completely. That evening, after Morrison had left with his unsigned documents and Michael had stormed out muttering about impossible old women, I sat in Harold's study and began making the phone calls that would change everything. The first call was to Judge Morrison, but it wasn't the confused plea for help that Michael and his lawyer had feared. It was the calculated move of a strategist activating her network. "Henry," I said when Judge Morrison answered. "It's Penelope Harrington. Harold's funeral was yesterday, and we have a problem." Judge Morrison and I had known each other for over 30 years, not just as family friends, but as professional colleagues. He had been a practicing attorney when I first started my career, and we had worked together on several complex estate cases. More importantly, he knew exactly who I was and what I was capable of. "Penny, I was wondering when I'd hear from you," he said, and I could hear the concern in his voice. "I was surprised not to see you at Harold's service yesterday." "That's part of the problem, Henry. My son locked me in my bedroom to prevent me from attending my own husband's funeral. Today, he brought a lawyer named Bradley Morrison to my house with documents designed to transfer control of Harold's entire estate to him." The silence on the other end of the line was profound. Judge Morrison had seen every kind of elder abuse case imaginable, but the audacity of what I was describing still shocked him. "Did you sign anything?" he asked finally. "Of course not. But Henry, this is bigger than simple financial manipulation. Michael has been systematically isolating me and building a narrative about my mental incompetence. I think he's planning to have me declared unable to manage my own affairs." "Jesus, Penny, how can I help?" "I need you to make some calls, quietly. I need to know if anyone has been asking questions about me. Doctors, social workers, anyone who might be involved in competency proceedings. And I need you to reach out to Eleanor Thompson." Eleanor Thompson was the district attorney, another old colleague who had built her career prosecuting financial crimes against the elderly. If Michael was planning what I suspected he was planning, Eleanor would want to know about it. Consider it done. "But Penny, are you safe? Do you need somewhere to stay?" "I'm safer than Michael realizes," I said. "He thinks he's hunting a helpless old woman. He has no idea what he's actually dealing with." The second call was to Peterson, Harold's longtime attorney and my former colleague. Despite Michael's dismissive comments about Peterson being old and out of touch, the man was still one of the sharpest legal minds I knew. "Penelope, my dear," Peterson said when he heard my voice, "I've been worried about you. How are you holding up?" "I'm about to be much better, William, but I need your help. Has anyone contacted your office asking questions about Harold's will or our estate planning?" "Actually, yes. Yesterday afternoon, a young attorney named Morrison called claiming to represent the family. He was asking very specific questions about asset distribution and whether there were any provisions for mental incapacity. I told him to contact you directly, of course." "Of course you did. William, I need you to do something for me. I need you to review every document Michael has access to and tell me exactly what he knows about our estate plan." "Penny, what's going on?" I explained the situation, and Peterson's reaction was immediate and decisive. "We need to meet. Tomorrow morning, 9 o'clock, my office. And Penny, don't sign anything. Don't agree to any medical examinations, and don't let them isolate you again." The third call was the most important one, to my former law firm partner, Margaret Chen, who now ran one of the most prestigious family law practices in the state. Margaret and I had built our careers together, handling some of the most complex inheritance disputes in the region. She knew my work, my competence, and most importantly, my reputation. "Penny, I was so sorry to hear about Harold. How are you managing?" "I'm managing by getting ready to destroy my son's attempt to steal everything Harold and I worked for," I said bluntly. Margaret's laugh was sharp and appreciative. "There's the Penny I know. Tell me everything." I laid out the situation in detail, and Margaret listened with the focused attention of a predator hearing about prey. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. "Penny, this is extraordinary. The level of planning and manipulation involved. This isn't some spur-of-the-moment desperation. Your son has been planning this for a long time." "I know. The question is, how long and who else is involved? I'll find out. I'm going to put my best investigator on this immediately. We'll trace every phone call, every meeting, every document. If Michael has been building a case for your incompetency, we'll know about it by tomorrow evening. There's something else, Margaret. I think there might be financial irregularities in Harold's business accounts. Michael has been far too confident about taking over the company. I suspect he may have already been positioning himself as the heir apparent. Embezzlement? Possibly. Or at least financial impropriety. Harold wasn't well enough to handle day-to-day operations for the past year. Michael had been helping with various business matters. We'll audit everything. Penny, I have to ask, how do you want to handle this? Quietly, through negotiation, or do you want to go nuclear? I thought about Michael's face when he had locked me in my room, about his casual dismissal of my grief, about his assumption that I was too stupid and helpless to understand what he was doing to me. Margaret, my son prevented me from attending my husband's funeral and then tried to steal my inheritance while I was still in mourning. What do you think? Nuclear it is. Penny, by the time we're done with this, Michael is going to wish he had never been born. The fourth and final call was to someone Michael would never have expected, his own wife, Jennifer. But this wasn't the confrontational call he might have feared. Instead, I called Jennifer's sister, Rebecca, who had always been uncomfortable with her sister's marriage to Michael. Mrs. Harrington, I'm so sorry about Mr. Harrington, Rebecca said when she answered. Thank you, dear. Rebecca, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me. Has Jennifer said anything about Harold's death being a good thing for the family financially? The pause that followed told me everything I needed to know. Mrs. Harrington, I don't want to cause trouble. Rebecca, trouble is already here. I just need to know how deep it goes. Jennifer has been talking for months about how much money you and Mr. Harrington had, and how unfair it was that you might spend it all on medical care or nursing homes. She said it was their children's inheritance being wasted on keeping old people alive longer than necessary. The coldness of it took my breath away. My own daughter-in-law had been calculating the value of Harold's death while he was still fighting for his life. Has she mentioned anything about me needing special care or supervision? She said you were getting senile and that someone needed to step in before you gave all the money away to charities or got scammed by criminals. She said Michael was going to have to take control of things for everyone's good. Everyone's good. The family phrase that actually meant their good exclusively. Rebecca, I'm going to ask you to do something that might be difficult. I need you to keep listening to what Jennifer says about this situation, and I need you to remember every detail. Can you do that for me? Mrs. Harrington, Jennifer is my sister, but what she and Michael are doing to you is wrong. Mr. Harrington was always so good to our family. Yes, I'll help you. By 10 o'clock that night, I had set in motion a legal and investigative network that would have impressed any prosecutor. Judge Morrison was quietly checking court records for any preliminary filings. Peterson was reviewing our estate documents for vulnerabilities. Margaret was mobilizing her firm's considerable resources. And Rebecca was now my inside source on Michael and Jennifer's real plans and timeline. But the most important thing I had accomplished that day wasn't making phone calls or gathering allies. It was the realization that Michael's plan was far more sophisticated and far-reaching than I had initially understood. This wasn't just about greed or impatience. This was a carefully orchestrated campaign to systematically destroy my autonomy and independence, piece by piece, until I became completely dependent on his control. The scope of it was breathtaking, and it told me something crucial about my son that I had been trying to ignore. He wasn't just greedy, he was cruel. The man who had locked me in my room and prevented me from saying goodbye to my husband wasn't someone who had temporarily lost his way. He was someone who had revealed his true nature. As I sat in Harold's study, surrounded by 40 years of legal books and case files, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years, the thrill of a complex case with high stakes and a clear enemy. I was no longer just a grieving widow. I was back to being what I had always been, a lawyer with a case to win. And Michael had just made the mistake of declaring war on someone who had never lost a war. Tomorrow, the real battle would begin. Thursday morning brought revelations that exceeded even my worst suspicions. By 7 a.m., my phone was ringing with updates from the network I had activated the night before. The picture that emerged was so comprehensive, so calculating, that even with my decades of experience in family law, I was stunned by the sheer audacity of what Michael had orchestrated. Margaret called first, her voice tight with professional anger. "Penny, you need to sit down for this. My investigator worked through the night, and what we found it's extraordinary." "Tell me everything." "Michael has been planning this for over 2 years. We found records of consultations with elder law attorneys dating back to 18 months ago. Not about protecting you or Harold, but about the legal procedures for having someone declared incompetent. He's been researching conservatorship laws, adult protective services protocols, everything. 2 years. While I was taking care of Harold through chemotherapy, while I was holding his hand through sleepless nights and driving him to endless medical appointments, my son was researching how to have me declared mentally incompetent. There's more. 3 months ago he met with Dr. Patricia Williams. She specializes in geriatric psychiatry and has a reputation for being very flexible in her assessments of elderly patients' mental capacity. We found a record of Michael paying her a consultation fee. Dr. Patricia Williams. I knew that name from court cases where families had used questionable psychiatric evaluations to gain control over elderly relatives' assets. She was the kind of doctor who saw dementia everywhere she looked, especially when someone was paying her to find it. "Margaret, please tell me there's more." "Oh, there's much more. Michael has been meeting regularly with Harold's business partners for the past 6 months, not just casual meetings, formal strategy sessions about the transition and maintaining continuity of leadership. They've been planning Harold's succession as if Harold were already dead. The betrayal was so profound it was almost surreal. Michael had been conducting business meetings about taking over his father's company while Harold was still alive, still fighting cancer, still believing his son was supporting him through his illness. Did Harold know? There's no evidence that he did. In fact, there's evidence that Michael was actively concealing these meetings from both of you. We found communications where Michael specifically instructed the business partners not to mention the succession discussions to Harold, claiming it would be too stressful for him during his treatment. Judge Morrison called 20 minutes later with information that made my blood run cold. "Penny, I've been checking court records and talking to some contacts in adult protective services. There's been a preliminary inquiry filed about you." "What kind of inquiry?" "Someone reported concerns about your mental state and your ability to manage financial affairs. The report claims you've been showing signs of confusion and making irrational decisions since Harold's death. It was filed anonymously, but the details are very specific, too specific to be from a casual observer. It was Michael, almost certainly. But here's the thing, Penny. The report was filed last Friday. Harold died on Friday. Someone filed a complaint about your mental incompetence on the same day your husband died. The timing was impossible to ignore. Michael hadn't even waited for Harold's body to be cold before initiating proceedings to have me declared incompetent. He had been ready, prepared, with paperwork filed within hours of his father's death. "Henry, what happens next with this inquiry?" Normally, Adult Protective Services would conduct an investigation. They'd interview you, possibly arrange for a mental health evaluation, review your living situation. But Penny, because I know the system and I know you, I was able to slow things down. I've arranged for the case to be assigned to Sarah Martinez. She's thorough, fair, and she knows the difference between grief and dementia. How much time do I have? A few days, maybe a week. But Penny, you need to be prepared. If Michael is serious about this, he'll escalate quickly. Once someone is declared incompetent, reversing it can take months or years. Peterson's call came at 9:30 with the financial information I had been dreading to hear. "Penelope, I've been reviewing Harold's business accounts, and we have a serious problem. There have been irregular transfers over the past 8 months. Money moved from the business operating accounts into investment funds that Michael has been managing." "How much money?" "Nearly $600,000. All of it justified as business investments or diversification strategies. But the funds are now in accounts that Michael controls directly. $600,000. My son had been systematically embezzling from his dying father's business while pretending to help manage it during Harold's illness. Is it recoverable? Possibly, but it would require proving that Michael didn't have authorization to make those transfers. Given that Harold was ill and Michael was acting as his business proxy, it could be legally complicated. Unless we can prove that Michael was already implementing a plan to steal the business before Harold died. Exactly. If we can show that these transfers were part of a premeditated scheme rather than legitimate business decisions, we have grounds for both criminal and civil action. But the most devastating revelation came from Rebecca, Jennifer's sister, who called that afternoon with information that showed just how deep the conspiracy went. Mrs. Harrington, I need to tell you something that happened last week, before Mr. Harrington died. Jennifer was on the phone with Michael, and I overheard part of the conversation. She was asking if the doctor had given any new timeline for how much longer Mr. Harrington might live. What did Michael say? He said it didn't matter, because they were ready to move forward regardless. He said that once Mr. Harrington was gone, they would have maybe 48 hours while you were emotionally compromised to get the legal paperwork handled. 48 hours while I was emotionally compromised. They had been planning to exploit my grief as a window of opportunity to steal everything Harold and I had built together. Rebecca, did they say anything else? Jennifer asked what would happen if you didn't cooperate, if you insisted on getting your own lawyer or asking questions. Michael said that was already taken care of, that he had contingency plans for that situation. Contingency plans. The mental incompetency proceedings, the psychiatric evaluation, the adult protective services complaint. All of it had been prepared in advance as backup options in case I proved less malleable than expected. Mrs. Harrington, there's something else. Jennifer has been telling people that you're already showing signs of dementia. She's been having conversations with neighbors, with people at church, with family friends. She's been building a narrative about your mental decline for months. The social groundwork, of course. Michael and Jennifer hadn't just been preparing legal strategies. They had been conducting a whisper campaign designed to make everyone in our social circle believe that I was losing my mental faculties. When the time came for court proceedings, they would have a community of witnesses ready to testify about my supposed decline. As I sat in my kitchen that Thursday afternoon, reviewing all the information my network had gathered, I felt a strange mixture of devastation and admiration. The scope of Michael's planning was extraordinary. He had anticipated every possible obstacle and prepared counter-strategies for each one. He had been thorough, systematic, and utterly ruthless, but he had made one crucial miscalculation. He had planned his entire strategy around the assumption that I was exactly what I appeared to be, a grieving, confused elderly woman with no understanding of legal or business matters. He had never considered the possibility that appearances might be deceiving. Michael had spent 2 years preparing to battle a helpless victim. Instead, he was about to face a seasoned attorney with 40 years of experience, extensive professional connections, and most importantly, righteous fury at being betrayed by her own child. The war he had declared was about to become very real and very costly, but the casualties wouldn't be who he expected them to be. That evening, as I prepared for what I knew would be the most important legal battle of my career, I thought about something Harold used to say. The most dangerous opponent is the one who lets you think you're winning until the moment you discover you've already lost. Michael was about to learn the truth of those words. Friday morning, I did something that would have seemed impossible just a week ago. I got dressed for war. Not the emotional, chaotic kind of war that Michael expected from a grieving widow, but the methodical, calculated warfare that had made me legendary in courtrooms for 4 decades. I put on my navy blue suit, the one I had worn to my most important cases, and I prepared to remind the world exactly who Penelope Harrington really was. The first phase of my counterattack required perfect timing and flawless execution. I needed Michael to believe he was still winning, while I systematically dismantled everything he had built. The key was making him overconfident, making him rush into mistakes that would expose the full scope of his conspiracy. At 9 a.m., I called Michael with exactly the performance he wanted to hear. "Michael, honey, I've been thinking about what you said yesterday," I began, allowing my voice to sound tired and defeated. "Maybe you're right. Maybe I'm not capable of handling all these complicated business matters." The relief in his voice was immediate and obvious. "Mom, I'm so glad you're starting to see things clearly. This is really the best thing for everyone. I was wondering if that nice lawyer could come back today. I think I'm ready to sign those papers now." "Of course. I'll call Morrison right away." "Mom, you're making the right decision. Dad would be proud of you for being so reasonable." Dad would be proud. The hypocrisy was breathtaking, but I kept my voice steady. There's just one small thing I'd like to do first. I'd like to visit Harold's grave to say goodbye properly. I feel like I need his permission before I sign anything important." This was the crucial moment. I was betting that Michael's arrogance would override his caution, that his eagerness to close the deal would make him agree to anything that seemed harmless. That's a beautiful idea, Mom. Very appropriate. We can go this morning and then come back here for the paperwork this afternoon. Perfect. Could we maybe stop by the bank afterward? I'd like to put Harold's important papers in the safety deposit box just to keep them secure. Sure. Whatever you need to feel comfortable with this transition. The bank visit wasn't about storing papers. It was about retrieving them. Specifically, it was about accessing documents that would prove Michael had been lying about virtually everything he had told me about Harold's business and our finances. While Michael made his triumphant phone calls to Morrison and Jennifer, I made my own calls to complete the preparation of my trap. "Margaret, he's bringing me to the cemetery and then to the bank this morning. Are your people in position?" "Everything's ready, Penny. We'll have photographic evidence of you conducting complex financial business competently and independently. Judge Morrison is prepared to testify about your mental acuity. Dr. Roberts has cleared his afternoon to conduct a comprehensive cognitive assessment that will demolish any claims of dementia. What about the business audit? Peterson finished it this morning. Penny, Michael's embezzlement is worse than we thought. He's been systematically moving money for over a year, not 8 months. The total is closer to $1.2 million. $1.2 million. My son hadn't just been stealing from his dying father. He had been conducting a massive long-term embezzlement operation while posing as a devoted son, helping with business matters. Is it traceable? Absolutely. And here's the beautiful part. Some of the transfers happened after you supposedly became mentally incompetent, but before Harold died. If Michael claims you were unable to understand financial matters, he'll have to explain how his father authorized million-dollar transfers while terminally ill and heavily medicated. The legal contradictions in Michael's position were becoming insurmountable. He couldn't claim that both Harold and I were competent enough to authorize his business activities, but incompetent enough to need his protection and control. At 11 a.m., Michael arrived to take me to the cemetery, and I played my role perfectly. I moved slowly, spoke hesitantly, and appeared confused by simple decisions. Michael's satisfaction was written all over his face. He truly believed he had broken me down and won. The cemetery visit was genuinely emotional, but not for the reasons Michael assumed. Standing at Harold's grave, I wasn't just saying goodbye to my husband. I was drawing strength from 45 years of partnership with a man who had always supported my intelligence and independence. Harold would have been furious at what Michael was doing, and he would have been proud of how I was handling it. "I love you, Harold," I whispered, placing roses on his headstone. "And I promise you, our son will not get away with this." Michael, standing respectfully nearby, probably thought I was having a moment of sentimental weakness. He had no idea I was making a vow that would soon destroy his entire world. The bank visit was where my performance reached its peak. I had called ahead and arranged for the bank manager, Mrs. Patterson, to assist me personally. Mrs. Patterson had known Harold and me for 20 years, and she understood exactly what was happening. "Mrs. Harrington," she said warmly when we arrived. "I was so sorry to hear about Harold. How are you managing?" "It's been difficult," I replied, allowing my voice to tremble slightly. "That's why Michael is helping me with all the business matters now. I just don't understand these things the way Harold did." But then, once we were in the safety deposit box area, my entire demeanor changed. With Michael watching, I began methodically reviewing documents, asking specific and sophisticated questions about account structures and legal implications. I discussed estate planning strategies with Mrs. Patterson, referenced complex tax law, and demonstrated a thorough understanding of financial matters that no one with dementia could possibly possess. Michael's face grew increasingly confused as he watched his supposedly incompetent mother conduct business with the precision and expertise of the seasoned attorney she had always been. "Mom, I thought you said you didn't understand these financial matters," he said uncertainly. "Oh, I understand them perfectly well," I replied matter-of-factly, still reviewing documents. "I just didn't want to burden you with the details while you were grieving your father's death." The look of dawning realization on Michael's face was absolutely priceless. For the first time, he was beginning to suspect that perhaps his mother wasn't quite the helpless victim he had assumed she was. Mrs. Patterson, playing her role beautifully, began asking me detailed questions about investment strategies and legal structures. I answered each one with the kind of expertise that comes from decades of professional experience, making it obvious to anyone watching that my mental faculties were not just intact, but exceptionally sharp. Mrs. Harrington, would you like me to have our legal department review these business transfer documents? Mrs. Patterson asked, holding up the papers that Morrison had prepared. Some of these clauses seem unusually broad for standard power of attorney forms. That's an excellent idea, I said, then turned to Michael with apparent innocence. You don't mind if the bank's lawyers review the papers before I sign them, do you, Michael? It's just good business practice. Michael was trapped. If he objected to legal review, it would make him appear suspicious and controlling. If he agreed, the bank's attorneys would immediately identify the documents as a sophisticated theft mechanism. Of course, Mom. Whatever makes you feel comfortable. But I could see the panic starting to build in his eyes. His carefully orchestrated plan was beginning to unravel, and he was starting to realize that perhaps he had drastically underestimated his opponent. That afternoon, back at the house, Michael paced nervously while we waited for Morrison to arrive with the revised documents. Jennifer sat in the living room, her earlier confidence replaced by anxiety, as she sensed that something had gone wrong. Mom, about what happened at the bank today, Michael began hesitantly. I was surprised by how sharp you seemed when discussing business matters. Was I? I hadn't noticed. Harold always said I had a good head for these things, even if I don't like dealing with them. It was a perfectly calibrated response, acknowledging my competence while maintaining the pretense that it was nothing unusual. Michael was left wondering whether my earlier confusion had been genuine grief or something else entirely. When Morrison arrived at 3 p.m., his confidence from 2 days ago had been replaced by nervous uncertainty. The bank's legal review had obviously rattled him, and he was beginning to understand that this case was more complicated than he had initially realized. Mrs. Harrington, he said carefully, I understand you had some questions about the documents we prepared. Oh yes. Quite a few questions. You see, I spent 40 years as an estate planning attorney, and some of the language in your documents is rather unusual. The silence in the room was absolute. Morrison went pale. Michael's mouth fell open. Jennifer made a small choking sound. I smiled pleasantly at them, the same smile I had used in courtrooms when opposing counsel realized they had walked into a trap. Did I forget to mention that? How silly of me. Yes, I'm a retired attorney. Graduated from Harvard Law School, class of 1978. I specialized in estate planning and family law. I've handled hundreds of cases involving exactly the kind of documents you've prepared. The trap had been set, and they had walked directly into it. Now came the part where I would show them exactly what it felt like to be hunted. The revelation of my legal background hit the room like a physical force. Morrison's face went from pale to gray, and his hands actually trembled as he shuffled through his carefully prepared documents. Michael stared at me with an expression I had never seen before, a mixture of shock, fear, and dawning comprehension that he had made a catastrophic miscalculation. You're a lawyer? He stammered. Was a lawyer, I corrected gently. Retired 5 years ago, but you know what they say about riding a bicycle. Some skills you never really lose. I picked up Morrison's documents and began flipping through them with the casual expertise of someone who had reviewed thousands of similar papers. For instance, I can still spot predatory legal language from across a room. Jennifer found her voice first. Why didn't you ever tell us you were an attorney? It was such an absurd question that I almost laughed. Jennifer, dear, we've known each other for 15 years. You've never once asked me about my career or my background. You've never shown the slightest interest in anything about me except whether I was going to interfere with your plans for spending Harold's money. The accusation hung in the air like a sword, and Jennifer's face flushed red with anger and embarrassment. But I wasn't done. Besides, I continued, it's been fascinating to watch how you both behaved when you thought I was helpless and ignorant. Very educational, from a psychological perspective. Morrison was gathering his papers with obvious desperation to escape the situation. Mrs. Harrington, I think there may have been some miscommunication about your circumstances. Perhaps we should reschedule this discussion when you've had more time to process your grief. Oh, I don't think that will be necessary, Mr. Morrison. You see, I've had time to review your documents very carefully, and I have some concerns about their legal validity. Morrison froze. Concerns? Well, for starters, several of the clauses in your power of attorney documents exceed the scope of what's legally permissible under state law. The sections dealing with property transfers and medical decision-making authority are particularly problematic. I was making this up as I went along, but Morrison didn't know that. His guilty conscience and his knowledge that the documents were indeed predatory made him assume that I had identified real legal flaws. Additionally, I continued, I'm curious about your client relationship with Michael. You see, in order for you to represent my interests in these transactions, I would need to be your client. But since Michael contacted you and is paying your fees, you're actually representing his interests, not mine. That creates a rather serious conflict of interest, doesn't it? Morrison's face went completely white. I had hit on a genuine legal problem, and he knew it. An attorney cannot claim to be protecting someone's interests while simultaneously working for and being paid by the person who is trying to take advantage of them. I think I need to review the ethical implications of this situation, Morrison said quickly. Perhaps we should postpone any document signing until I can consult with my firm's ethics committee. That sounds very wise, I said pleasantly. Take all the time you need. Morrison practically ran out of the house, leaving Michael and Jennifer alone with me in the living room. The dynamic had shifted completely. 10 minutes ago, they had been the hunters and I had been the prey. Now they were sitting in my house, having just discovered that their intended victim was actually a predator who had been studying them the entire time. Mom, Michael said slowly, how long have you known what we were trying to do? Since the moment you locked me in my bedroom, dear. You see, when someone spends 4 decades handling family law cases, they recognize the patterns of elder abuse very quickly. Your behavior has been textbook: isolation, control, manipulation of my emotional state, and attempts to create a legal framework for stealing my assets. Jennifer stood up abruptly. This is insane. We're trying to help you and you're treating us like criminals. Are you criminals, Jennifer? I asked mildly. Because if you're not, then you have nothing to worry about. But if you are, I let the sentence hang in the air. Michael was staring at me with something approaching awe. You've been playing us this whole time. Not playing, Michael. Observing, documenting, building a case. I walked to Harold's desk and pulled out a folder that had been sitting there in plain sight for days. Would you like to see what I've discovered about your activities over the past 2 years? The folder contained copies of everything Margaret's investigator had uncovered. Records of Michael's meetings with elder law attorneys, evidence of his consultations with Dr. Williams, documentation of his business meetings about Harold's succession, and most damning of all, a complete audit of the financial transfers he had been making from Harold's business accounts. I spread the papers across the coffee table like a prosecutor presenting evidence to a jury. This is interesting reading, Michael. Particularly the part where you transferred $650,000 from your dying father's business accounts into investment funds that you control personally. Michael's face went completely white. That money was for business investments. Dad approved all of those transfers. Did he? Because according to these bank records, several of the largest transfers occurred on days when Harold was heavily sedated for chemotherapy treatments. It would be very difficult for him to have approved complex financial transactions while under the influence of morphine and anti-nausea medications. I pulled out another document. And this is fascinating. A consultation record from Dr. Patricia Williams, dated 3 months ago. You paid her $1,500 to discuss assessment protocols for elderly patients with cognitive decline. Were you planning your father's mental health evaluation too, or just mine? Jennifer was backing toward the door, her face pale with panic. But I wasn't finished. Oh, and Jennifer, I have some interesting information about your conversations with neighbors and church members. Apparently, you've been telling people for months that I'm showing signs of dementia. Building a narrative, one might say, for future court proceedings. The evidence was overwhelming, and both Michael and Jennifer knew it. But what they didn't understand yet was that this wasn't the end of my presentation. It was just the beginning. The most interesting thing, though, I continued, is the timeline. Michael, you filed a complaint with Adult Protective Services about my mental competence on Friday afternoon, the same day your father died. You didn't even wait for his body to be cold before you began proceedings to have me declared incompetent. Michael tried to speak, but no words came out. The weight of his own actions, laid out methodically and undeniably, had left him speechless. Here's what's going to happen, I said, my voice taking on the authoritative tone I had used in courtrooms for decades. You have 48 hours to return every penny you've stolen from Harold's business accounts. You will withdraw the complaint you filed with Adult Protective Services, and you will cease all contact with Dr. Williams and any other medical professionals you've consulted about having me declared incompetent. And if we don't? Jennifer asked defiantly. I smiled at her with the cold precision of a predator who has cornered her prey. Then I will file criminal charges for elder abuse, financial exploitation, and conspiracy to commit fraud. I will sue you both civilly for damages, including punitive damages for the emotional distress you caused Harold during his final months. And I will make sure that every person in this community knows exactly what kind of people you really are. The threat was comprehensive and devastating, but it was also completely legal and entirely within my power to execute. Michael and Jennifer were beginning to understand that they weren't dealing with a confused, grieving widow. They were facing a seasoned attorney who had 40 years of experience destroying people who tried to take advantage of vulnerable families. Furthermore, I continued, I will be conducting a complete forensic audit of all business activities you've been involved in over the past 2 years. If I find additional evidence of fraud or embezzlement, I will turn that information over to the district attorney's office. Michael finally found his voice. Mom, you can't be serious. I'm your son. Yes, you are my son. And you locked me in a room to prevent me from attending my husband's funeral. You tried to steal everything your father and I worked for. You planned to have me declared mentally incompetent and committed to a care facility. You are my son, Michael, and that makes your betrayal so much worse than if you were a stranger. The room was silent, except for the sound of Jennifer crying. But they weren't tears of remorse. They were tears of frustration and fear at being caught. You have 48 hours, I repeated. And just so we're clear, this conversation is being recorded. So if you're thinking about trying to claim that your elderly mother is making false accusations due to dementia, you might want to reconsider. It was a bluff. I wasn't actually recording the conversation. But Michael and Jennifer didn't know that, and their guilty consciences made them assume that I was several steps ahead of them, which I was. As they left my house that evening, defeated and terrified, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years, the satisfaction of a perfectly executed legal strategy. But more than that, I felt the pride of someone who had refused to be victimized, who had fought back against people who assumed that age and grief made me helpless. Michael had declared war on the wrong person, and now he was about to discover exactly what that mistake was going to cost him. Saturday morning dawned with the kind of crystalline clarity that comes after a storm. I woke up feeling more like myself than I had in months. Not the grieving widow that Michael and Jennifer had tried to manipulate, but the formidable attorney who had built a reputation on preparation, strategy, and the relentless pursuit of justice. The 48-hour deadline I had given them was not arbitrary. It was calculated to create maximum pressure while giving me time to complete the final phase of my preparation. Because while Michael and Jennifer were scrambling to figure out how to return stolen money without admitting guilt, I was putting the finishing touches on a legal trap that would ensure they could never threaten me again. My first call was to Margaret, who had been working through the night with her team to complete the most comprehensive case file I had ever seen. "Penny, we've found things that will make your head spin," Margaret said, her voice tight with professional excitement. "Michael's financial crimes go back 3 years, not 2. He's been systematically embezzling from Harold's business since before Harold got sick. How much? Total? Nearly $2.3 million. He created a complex network of shell companies and investment accounts, all designed to look like legitimate business diversification strategies. It's actually quite sophisticated. If he had put this much effort into honest business, he might have been successful. $2.3 million. My son hadn't just been stealing from his dying father. He had been conducting a long-term, premeditated campaign of theft that predated Harold's illness by years. There's more, Margaret continued. We found evidence that Michael has been forging Harold's signature on business documents for over a year. Bank authorizations, contract modifications, partnership agreements, all signed in Harold's name by someone else. Can we prove it's Michael's handwriting? We don't need to. We have security camera footage from the bank showing Michael signing documents and presenting them as Harold's authorizations. He's been impersonating his father in official business transactions. Forgery and impersonation added federal charges to the growing list of crimes Michael had committed. Each new revelation made his position more desperate and my case stronger. What about Jennifer's involvement? She's been more active than you might expect. She's the one who incorporated several of the shell companies that Michael used to hide the stolen money. She's also been conducting the social media campaign to convince people that you're mentally incompetent. Social media campaign? Facebook posts, community forum discussions, conversations with neighbors, all designed to create a documented record of your supposed cognitive decline. She's been very systematic about building evidence that could be used in court to support a competency challenge. The scope of their conspiracy was breathtaking. This hadn't been a desperate grab for money after Harold's death. It had been a multi-year campaign to position themselves to inherit everything while systematically destroying my credibility and independence. Judge Morrison called at 9 a.m. with updates on the legal proceedings that Michael had initiated. Penny, I've managed to get the Adult Protective Services complaint transferred to a different investigator, and I've scheduled your competency evaluation for Monday morning with Dr. Sarah Rodriguez. She's one of the most respected geriatric psychiatrists in the state, and she has a reputation for being able to distinguish between grief and dementia. What should I expect? A comprehensive evaluation, cognitive tests, memory assessments, discussions about your daily living capabilities. But Penny, based on our conversation yesterday and your handling of this entire situation, I can't imagine any qualified psychiatrist finding evidence of mental incompetence. What about Michael's complaint itself? Can we use it against him? Absolutely. The fact that he filed it on the same day Harold died, combined with all the evidence of his financial crimes, creates a clear pattern of predatory behavior. Any judge is going to see that the competency complaint was filed as part of a scheme to steal your inheritance, not out of genuine concern for your welfare. Peterson called with information about Harold's business that added another dimension to Michael's criminal exposure. Penelope, I've been reviewing the corporate structure of Harold's company, and Michael's embezzlement has created serious legal liabilities. Some of the money he stole was from client escrow accounts, money that legally belongs to the company's customers. Client funds? That's felony theft, potentially at the federal level if any of the clients had interstate business. Michael isn't just facing charges for stealing from family. He's facing charges for stealing from dozens of innocent third parties. The legal net was tightening around Michael in ways he probably hadn't anticipated. When you steal from family members, it's a crime. When you steal from business clients, it becomes a federal case with much more serious consequences. But the most satisfying call came from Rebecca, Jennifer's sister, who had been documenting Michael and Jennifer's increasingly frantic conversations over the past 24 hours. Mrs. Harrington, they're panicking. Jennifer has been calling Michael every hour, and they're fighting about what to do. Michael is saying they should try to negotiate with you, maybe return some of the money in exchange for you dropping the charges. But Jennifer is saying they should stick to the original plan and try to have you committed. Jennifer wants to proceed with the competency challenge. She's convinced that if they can get you declared mentally incompetent, nothing else will matter. She says that mentally incompetent people can't file criminal charges or sue anyone, and that all the evidence you've gathered would be inadmissible because you weren't legally capable of authorizing the investigation. It was actually a clever legal strategy, if completely immoral. If they could successfully have me declared incompetent, it would indeed complicate any legal proceedings I might initiate. Unfortunately for them, that ship had already sailed. Rebecca, has Jennifer said anything about trying to interfere with my psychiatric evaluation on Monday? She mentioned something about contacting Dr. Williams to see if she could influence the evaluation somehow. And she's been calling people to ask them to contact Adult Protective Services with additional complaints about your behavior. Jennifer was doubling down on the conspiracy even as the evidence mounted against her. It was either remarkable stupidity or desperate determination, and frankly, I wasn't sure which possibility was more dangerous. That afternoon, I made a decision that would have seemed impossible a week ago. I called my granddaughter Emma, Michael's 25-year-old daughter, and asked her to meet me for coffee. Emma had always been my favorite grandchild, not because she was the oldest or the most accomplished, but because she had Harold's integrity and my intellectual curiosity. If there was anyone in Michael's immediate family who might listen to reason, it would be Emma. "Grandma, I'm so sorry about Grandpa," Emma said when she arrived at the coffee shop. "And I'm sorry I haven't been around more since the funeral. Dad said you were having a hard time and needed space to grieve. Emma, I need to tell you some things about your father that are going to be very difficult to hear, but I need you to know the truth about what's been happening." Over the next hour, I laid out everything: the financial theft, the forged documents, the conspiracy to have me declared incompetent, the attempt to steal Harold's business. I showed her copies of the evidence, explained the legal implications, and made it clear that her father was facing serious criminal charges. Emma's reaction was exactly what I had hoped for: shock, followed by anger, followed by determination to help make things right. "Grandma, I had no idea. Dad told us that you were confused and that he was helping manage your finances because you couldn't handle them anymore. He made it sound like he was protecting you. Has your father asked you to do anything unusual recently? Any requests for help with paperwork or conversations with doctors or lawyers?" "Actually, yes. Last week he asked me to write a letter describing times when I thought you seemed confused or forgetful. He said it was for insurance purposes, to make sure you got the medical care you needed." Another piece of the conspiracy. Michael had been planning to use his own daughter's testimony as evidence of my mental decline. "Emma, I need to ask you something very important. Are you willing to testify about what your father asked you to do? Are you willing to help me stop him from destroying this family?" Emma looked at me with Harold's steady gaze and my own determination. "Grandma, tell me what you need me to do." By Sunday evening, every piece was in place. I had documented evidence of Michael's crimes, professional testimony about my mental competence, insider information about the ongoing conspiracy, and most importantly, I had allies within Michael's own family who were willing to stand up for what was right. Michael and Jennifer had 48 hours to return the stolen money and withdraw their legal challenges. But I already knew they weren't going to comply voluntarily. Jennifer's influence was pushing them toward escalation rather than surrender, and Michael's pride wouldn't let him admit defeat to his mother, which meant that Monday morning would bring the final confrontation, the moment when all of my preparation would be tested against their desperation. As I sat in Harold's study that Sunday night, reviewing my case files and preparing for battle, I thought about something my law school professor had told me 45 years ago. "The law is not about revenge, Penelope. It's about justice. But sometimes, when justice is properly applied, it feels an awful lot like revenge." Tomorrow, Michael and Jennifer would discover the difference between those two concepts, and they would learn that some people are simply too dangerous to betray. Monday morning arrived with the weight of inevitability. At exactly 9 a.m., 48 hours after I had given Michael and Jennifer their ultimatum, my phone rang. It was Michael, and I could hear the strain in his voice before he even spoke. "Mom, we need to talk. Have you returned the money you stole from your father's business accounts?" The silence stretched long enough to give me my answer. "It's not that simple," Michael said finally. "Some of those investments are locked up in long-term funds. I can't just liquidate everything overnight without taking massive losses. So you're telling me that you gambled with stolen money and lost?" "I didn't steal anything. Those were legitimate business investments made with Dad's full knowledge and approval." It was fascinating how he still believed his own lies, even when confronted with overwhelming evidence. But his desperation was showing. The confident manipulator from a week ago had been replaced by a man who was running out of options and time. "Michael, did you withdraw the complaint you filed with Adult Protective Services?" Another telling silence. "Actually, Mom, about that. Jennifer and I think it would be better if we proceed with getting you some professional help. Yesterday's conversation showed us that you're not thinking clearly about this situation. You're making accusations that don't make sense, and you seem to have developed some kind of paranoid delusions about people trying to hurt you." The audacity was breathtaking. Michael was trying to use my discovery of his crimes as evidence of my mental incompetence. It was actually a clever psychological manipulation. if I hadn't been a trained attorney with 40 years of experience recognizing exactly this kind of gaslighting. I see. So you've decided to escalate rather than comply with my terms. Mom, there are no terms. You're not in a position to make demands. You're clearly unwell, and we're going to make sure you get the care you need. The conversation ended there, but it had served its purpose. Michael had made his choice, and now I could proceed with a clear conscience. He had been given every opportunity to do the right thing, and he had chosen to double down on his betrayal instead. At 10 a.m., I had my appointment with Dr. Sarah Rodriguez for the psychiatric evaluation that would determine my mental competency. Dr. Rodriguez was a woman in her 50s with the kind of calm professionalism that comes from decades of working with elderly patients and their families. Mrs. Harrington, I understand you've been through a very difficult time recently. How are you feeling today? I'm feeling like a woman who has just discovered that her son is a criminal and her daughter-in-law is a conspirator, but whose mind is functioning perfectly well despite the emotional trauma of those discoveries. Dr. Rodriguez smiled slightly. That's a very precise way of describing your situation. Tell me about these discoveries. For the next 2 hours, I walked Dr. Rodriguez through everything. The financial evidence, the forged documents, the conspiracy timeline, the attempts to isolate me and manipulate my emotional state. I showed her copies of the documents Margaret had uncovered, explained the legal implications of Michael's actions, and demonstrated the kind of analytical thinking that no one with dementia could possibly possess. But more importantly, I allowed Dr. Rodriguez to see who I really was, not the confused, grieving widow that Michael and Jennifer had been portraying, but the sharp, competent attorney who had been systematically building a case against people who had underestimated her. Mrs. Harrington, have you been experiencing any confusion about time, place, or identity? Only confusion about how I raised a son who could do this to his own family. Any problems with memory, particularly short-term memory? My memory is excellent. For instance, I remember exactly what Michael said when he locked me in my bedroom. It's just a stupid ceremony. I remember the look in his eyes when he realized I was an attorney. And I remember every detail of every crime he's committed, because I've been documenting all of it. The evaluation continued with cognitive tests, memory assessments, and discussions about my daily living capabilities. Every question Dr. Rodriguez asked, I answered with precision and detail. Every test she administered, I completed flawlessly. Mrs. Harrington, based on this evaluation, I see no evidence of cognitive impairment, dementia, or any mental health condition that would affect your capacity to make decisions about your own life and finances. In fact, your cognitive function appears to be exceptional for someone of any age. Will you be willing to testify to that conclusion in court if necessary? Absolutely. And Mrs. Harrington? I've been doing this for 25 years, and I've seen many cases of families trying to exploit elderly relatives. What your son and daughter-in-law have done to you is among the most calculating and cruel examples I've encountered. At noon, I returned home to find Michael and Jennifer waiting in my living room with Dr. Patricia Williams, the psychiatrist Michael had consulted about having me declared incompetent. They had apparently decided to conduct their own evaluation to counter Dr. Rodriguez's assessment. Mrs. Harrington, Dr. Williams said with false warmth, your family has asked me to speak with you about some concerns they have about your recent behavior. Have they told you that I'm a retired attorney with 40 years of experience in family law and estate planning? Dr. Williams's confident smile faltered slightly. They mentioned that you've been making some claims about having legal training, but they're concerned that these might be part of a fantasy construct related to your grief response. A fantasy construct. The woman was suggesting that my entire professional career was a delusion brought on by Harold's death. The psychological manipulation was so transparent and offensive that I almost laughed. Dr. Williams, what did Michael pay you to diagnose me with? Mrs. Harrington, that's not how psychiatric evaluation works. I'm here to conduct an objective assessment of your mental state. Are you? Because I have documentation showing that Michael paid you $1,500 3 months ago to discuss assessment protocols for elderly patients with cognitive decline. That sounds less like an objective evaluation and more like a paid consultation on how to manufacture a diagnosis. Dr. Williams went pale. Michael and Jennifer exchanged panicked glances. Furthermore, I continued, I have a recording of Michael explaining to someone that he had contingency plans for the situation where I didn't cooperate with his attempts to steal my inheritance. Are you part of those contingency plans, Dr. Williams? It was another bluff. I didn't have such a recording. But the guilty parties didn't know that, and their reactions told me everything I needed to know. I think there's been some misunderstanding, Dr. Williams said quickly, gathering her papers. Perhaps we should reschedule this evaluation for a time when emotions aren't running so high. I don't think that will be necessary, I said pleasantly. You see, I've already been evaluated by Dr. Sarah Rodriguez this morning. She found no evidence of mental impairment whatsoever. In fact, she said my cognitive function was exceptional. Dr. Williams practically ran out of the house, leaving Michael and Jennifer alone with me once again. But this time, the power dynamic was completely different. They were no longer hunters pursuing vulnerable prey. They were criminals who had just realized they were trapped. Mom, you can't seriously think you can fight us on this, Michael said, but his voice lacked conviction. Michael, I don't think I can fight you. I know I can destroy you. The question is whether you're smart enough to surrender before I do. I walked to Harold's desk and pulled out a thick folder, a complete dossier of evidence that Margaret's team had assembled. $2.3 million in documented theft, 3 years of forged signatures, conspiracy to commit fraud, elder abuse, financial exploitation. I counted off each charge on my fingers. Federal crimes, state crimes, civil liabilities. Michael, you're not just going to lose this fight. You're going to prison. Jennifer finally spoke up, her voice shaking with rage and fear. You can't prove any of this. You're just a bitter old woman who can't accept that her son is trying to help her. I looked at Jennifer with the cold smile I had perfected in 40 years of courtroom battles. Jennifer, dear, I've been building legal cases since before you were born. I know exactly what I can prove, and I have evidence you haven't even dreamed of yet. I pulled out one final document, a statement from Emma, Michael's own daughter, describing how her father had asked her to write false testimony about my mental state. Your own daughter is prepared to testify against you, Michael. Your own child thinks what you've done is morally reprehensible. The look of devastation on Michael's face when he realized that Emma had turned against him was almost worth everything I had endured. For the first time, he seemed to understand that his actions had consequences beyond just legal trouble. He had destroyed his own family's trust and respect. You have one last chance, I said quietly. Return every penny you've stolen, publicly apologize for what you've done, and accept whatever legal consequences follow. Or I will use every resource at my disposal to ensure that you spend the rest of your life paying for what you tried to do to me. Michael looked at Jennifer, then back at me, and I saw the moment when he finally understood that he had lost completely. The war was over. All that remained was determining the terms of surrender. Tuesday morning brought the sound I had been waiting for, the sound of desperation knocking at my door. But it wasn't Michael or Jennifer. It was Bradley Morrison, the young attorney who had tried to help them steal my inheritance, and he looked like a man who hadn't slept in days. Mrs. Harrington, I need to speak with you urgently. I let him into my living room, curious to see what final card he thought he could play. I want you to know that I had no idea about the full scope of what Michael was planning, Morrison began, his voice shaking slightly. When he first contacted me, he presented this as a standard family situation where an elderly parent needed help managing complex financial matters. And you didn't think to verify that story by speaking with me directly? I should have. You're absolutely right. I made assumptions based on Michael's presentation, and I didn't follow proper ethical protocols. Morrison pulled out an envelope. I'm here to give you this and to formally withdraw from any representation of Michael or Jennifer. The envelope contained copies of every document Morrison had prepared, along with detailed notes about every conversation he had had with Michael over the past 3 months. It was a complete betrayal of his former client, motivated by Morrison's desperate attempt to avoid being charged as an accessory to fraud. This shows the timeline of Michael's planning, Morrison explained. He first contacted me 4 months ago, not 3 months ago, as you thought. He specifically asked about the fastest ways to gain control of an elderly parent's assets, and he wanted to know about legal strategies that could be implemented quickly after the parent became widowed, 4 months ago. Michael had been planning to steal Harold's inheritance while Harold was still alive, still fighting cancer, still believing his son was supporting him through his illness. "There's something else," Morrison continued. "Michael asked me to research the legal procedures for having someone committed to a care facility against their will. He wanted to know if financial control automatically transferred to next of kin when someone was institutionalized. The institutional commitment. That had been Michael's ultimate plan, not just to steal my money, but to have me locked away in a nursing home where I couldn't interfere with his enjoyment of his theft. Mr. Morrison, why are you telling me this now? Because yesterday I received a call from the State Bar Association. Someone filed an ethics complaint against me related to this case. My law license is at risk, my reputation is ruined, and I'm facing potential criminal charges as an accessory to your son's crimes. Someone had filed an ethics complaint. That would be Margaret, acting on my behalf to ensure that everyone involved in the conspiracy faced appropriate consequences. I'm hoping that if I cooperate fully with any investigation, and if I provide you with complete documentation of Michael's planning, you might be willing to confirm that I was misled about the true nature of the situation." It was a reasonable request, and Morrison's information was valuable. But more importantly, his defection meant that Michael and Jennifer were now completely isolated, with no professional allies and no legal support. "I'll consider your request, Mr. Morrison. But I want you to understand something clearly. Your ethical failures created a situation where an elderly woman could have been financially destroyed and institutionalized against her will. That's not something I take lightly." After Morrison left, I called Margaret to update her on this latest development. "Penny, Morrison's information is pure gold. With his documentation of Michael's premeditation, we can prove that this wasn't just opportunistic theft after Harold's death. It was a long-term conspiracy that began while Harold was still alive." "What's the status of the criminal referral?" "The district attorney's office is treating this as a priority case. Elder abuse cases involving this level of financial theft typically result in significant prison sentences, especially when there's evidence of long-term planning and psychological manipulation." "And the civil case?" "We're going to destroy them, Penny. With the evidence we have, we can pursue damages for the stolen money, punitive damages for the emotional distress, and probably recover your attorney's fees as well. Michael and Jennifer are going to lose everything." But even as I was coordinating the legal destruction of my son and daughter-in-law, I was struggling with the emotional reality of what I was doing. Michael was still my child, still the little boy I had taught to ride a bicycle and helped with homework. The fact that he had become someone capable of such cruelty didn't erase 43 years of maternal love, even if it had certainly complicated those feelings. That afternoon, Emma called with information that added yet another dimension to the situation. "Grandma, I think you need to know. Dad and Jennifer are planning to leave town. I heard them talking about liquidating their remaining assets and moving to Florida, where Jennifer's mother lives. Flight risk. Of course. When criminals realize they're about to be arrested, they often try to flee to jurisdictions where they think they'll be harder to prosecute. Emma, how much time do we have? They're planning to leave this weekend. Dad has been selling things, his car, some of Jennifer's jewelry, anything they can convert to cash quickly." I immediately called Judge Morrison to report that Michael and Jennifer were preparing to flee. Within 2 hours, he had issued temporary restraining orders preventing them from leaving the state or disposing of any assets. By evening, sheriff's deputies were serving papers that effectively trapped them in place while the criminal investigation proceeded. But Michael's response to being legally cornered was more desperate and dangerous than I had anticipated. Wednesday morning, I woke up to find my car's tires slashed and my mailbox vandalized. Someone had spray-painted "crazy old bitch" across my garage door. The vandalism was petty and stupid, but it also represented an escalation that worried me. Michael was no longer trying to manipulate or deceive me. He was trying to intimidate me into dropping my pursuit of justice. I called the police, of course, and the vandalism was documented as evidence of harassment and intimidation. But more importantly, I realized that Michael's desperation had reached a level where he might be willing to do something truly dangerous. That evening, as I was reviewing case files in Harold's study, I heard the sound of someone trying to break into my house. Not the subtle sound of a burglar, but the aggressive noise of someone who didn't care about being detected. I called 911 and then moved to the kitchen where I could see the back door. Through the window, I could see Michael trying to force the lock with some kind of tool. His face was twisted with rage and desperation, and he was muttering to himself as he worked. When the lock finally gave way and Michael entered my house, he found me sitting calmly at the kitchen table with my phone in my hand and a very clear view of his breaking and entering. "Hello, Michael," I said quietly. "The police are on their way." "Mom, we need to end this insanity," Michael said, but his voice was shaking with emotion. "You're destroying our entire family over money that's going to end up with us anyway when you die." "I'm not destroying anything, Michael. I'm protecting myself from someone who tried to steal everything I have and have me committed to an institution. You can't prove any of that. Actually, I can prove all of it. Your own lawyer provided me with documentation of your planning. Your own daughter provided testimony about your attempts to manufacture evidence against me. And now you've just committed breaking and entering while under a restraining order." The sound of police sirens was getting closer, and Michael's desperation was reaching a crescendo. "Mom, please. I'm your son. This will destroy me. Jennifer, the kids, will lose everything. You should have thought about that before you locked me in my bedroom and prevented me from attending my husband's funeral." The police arrived just as Michael was beginning to realize that his final gambit had failed completely. As they handcuffed him in my kitchen and read him his rights, I felt something I hadn't expected to feel. Sadness, not regret for what I had done, but sadness for what Michael had chosen to become. Somewhere along the way, the little boy I had raised had transformed into someone capable of breathtaking cruelty toward the people who loved him most. As the police car pulled away with my son in custody, I sat in the kitchen where I had raised him and wondered how different things might have been if he had simply chosen to be the man I had tried to teach him to be. But those were questions for another day. Tonight, the immediate threat was over, and justice was finally being served. Thursday morning brought a phone call that marked the beginning of the end for Michael and Jennifer's criminal enterprise. It was District Attorney Eleanor Thompson, calling to inform me that both of them had been arrested and formally charged with multiple felonies. "Penelope, I want you to know that this case has our office's full attention," Eleanor said. "The level of premeditation and psychological manipulation involved makes this one of the most egregious elder abuse cases we've seen." "What are the specific charges?" "For Michael, elder abuse, financial exploitation, forgery, embezzlement, conspiracy to commit fraud, and now breaking and entering. For Jennifer, conspiracy, money laundering through the shell companies, and aiding and abetting financial exploitation. We're also looking at federal charges related to the business client funds that were stolen." Federal charges. The scope of Michael's crimes had grown beyond what even I had initially understood. The federal prosecutor is particularly interested in the fact that Michael used interstate banking systems to move stolen money across state lines. That elevates this from a local elder abuse case to a federal financial crime with much more serious consequences. What kind of sentences are we talking about? If convicted on all charges, Michael is looking at 15 to 20 years in federal prison. Jennifer could face 8 to 12 years. These aren't white-collar crimes with country club sentences. These are serious felonies with serious time. 20 years. My son, who had turned 43 last month, could spend the rest of his productive adult life in prison because he had decided that stealing from his dying father was easier than building his own success. But even as I absorbed the magnitude of Michael's legal catastrophe, I found myself thinking about something else, the other victims of his crimes. Harold's business clients who had trusted their money to a company that Michael had been systematically looting. The employees whose jobs might be at risk because of the financial damage Michael had caused. The extended family members who would be devastated to learn what Michael had done. Eleanor, what happens to the people Michael stole from? The business clients? That's actually part of why the federal prosecutor is so interested in this case. We're treating this as a major financial fraud with multiple victims. Recovery of funds and restitution will be a priority in any plea negotiations or sentencing. Recovery of funds. Which brought me to the question I had been avoiding. What did I actually want to happen to Michael and Jennifer? The answer was complicated. The lawyer in me wanted full prosecution and maximum sentences as deterrents for anyone else who might consider preying on elderly family members. But the mother in me was struggling with the reality that my pursuit of justice would destroy my son's life and leave my grandchildren without a father. That afternoon, I received an unexpected visitor. Jennifer's mother, Mrs. Patricia Kovac, a woman I had met only a few times over the years, but who had always seemed decent and reasonable. "Mrs. Harrington, I hope you'll forgive me for coming here without calling first," she said, her eyes red from crying. "I needed to speak with you about Jennifer and Michael." I invited her in, curious about what she might say. "I want you to know that I had no idea what they were planning," Mrs. Kovac began. "Jennifer told me that you were having problems managing your finances and that Michael was helping you through a difficult time. She never mentioned anything about stealing money or trying to have you committed." "What did she tell you about Harold's death?" "She said you were devastated and not thinking clearly, and that the family was rallying around to support you. She made it sound like Michael was being a devoted son." The lies had extended even to Jennifer's own mother. The deception had been so comprehensive that even people close to the situation had been manipulated into believing the false narrative. "Mrs. Kovac, I appreciate you coming here, but I'm not sure what you're hoping to accomplish." "I'm hoping to ask you to show mercy," she said quietly. "Not because they don't deserve punishment. What they did to you is unforgivable, but because there are innocent children involved. Emma and her younger brother don't deserve to lose both their parents to prison. The children. In all of my focus on building legal cases and pursuing justice, I had been trying not to think too much about Emma and her 16-year-old brother Jake, who would be devastated by their parents' crimes and imprisonment. Jennifer's always been selfish and manipulative," Mrs. Kovac continued, "but I never thought she was capable of something this cruel. And Michael, I don't understand how Harold's son could have done this to his own family." "Mrs. Kovac, what exactly are you asking me to do?" "I'm asking you to consider whether there might be a way to resolve this that doesn't completely destroy the children's lives. If Michael and Jennifer could make full restitution and accept responsibility for what they've done, maybe there could be a plea arrangement that wouldn't involve decades in prison." It was a reasonable request from a grandmother who was trying to protect her grandchildren from the consequences of their parents' crimes. But it also represented exactly the kind of thinking that allowed financial predators to escape appropriate consequences for their actions. "Mrs. Kovac, your daughter and my son didn't just steal money. They tried to have me declared mentally incompetent and committed to an institution. They were planning to take everything Harold and I worked for over 45 years and leave me helpless and alone. This isn't just about money. It's about the systematic destruction of my autonomy and dignity." Mrs. Kovac nodded sadly. "I understand that what they did was horrible. I just don't know how to explain to Emma and Jake that their parents might be in prison until they're adults themselves." After Mrs. Kovac left, I spent a long time thinking about mercy versus justice, about the difference between punishment and deterrence, and about what Harold would have wanted me to do. Harold had always believed in consequences for actions, but he had also believed in the possibility of redemption for people who were genuinely willing to change. The question was whether Michael and Jennifer were capable of genuine remorse and change, or whether they were simply sorry they had been caught. That evening, I received my answer. Margaret called with an update on plea negotiations that revealed Michael and Jennifer's true character even in the face of overwhelming evidence against them. "Penny, you're not going to believe this. Michael's attorney approached the prosecutor about a plea deal, and Michael's position is that he was acting in your best interests all along. He's claiming that he saw signs of your mental decline and was trying to protect the family assets from your poor decision-making." Even facing decades in prison, Michael was still trying to paint himself as the victim and me as the problem. It gets worse. Jennifer's attorney is arguing that she was just following her husband's lead and didn't understand the legal implications of what they were doing. She's trying to present herself as another victim of Michael's manipulation. No remorse, no acceptance of responsibility, no acknowledgement of the pain and trauma they had inflicted. Even with their backs against the wall, they were still lying and manipulating and trying to avoid the consequences of their choices. "Margaret, I want full prosecution. No plea deals, no reduced sentences, no mercy. They made their choice, and now they can live with the consequences. "Are you sure, Penny? The prosecutor is willing to negotiate if you're interested in a resolution that guarantees restitution and avoids the uncertainty of a trial." I thought about Mrs. Kovac's request for mercy, about Emma and Jake, about the possibility that Michael might someday become a better person if given the chance. But then I thought about Harold, who would never see his grandchildren grow up because Michael had been too impatient to wait for his natural inheritance. I thought about the months of manipulation and gaslighting I had endured while grieving my husband's death. I thought about being locked in my bedroom while my husband was buried without me. I'm sure, Margaret, some things are too important for mercy. The decision was made. Michael and Jennifer would face the full consequences of their actions, and I would finally have the justice that Harold deserved. But even as I made that choice, I knew it would come with costs I was only beginning to understand. 6 months later, I stood in a federal courtroom watching my son being sentenced to 18 years in prison. The judge's words were measured and final. "Mr. Harrington, you exploited your position of trust to prey upon your own family during their most vulnerable time. The systematic nature of your crimes and your complete lack of remorse leave this court no choice but to impose a sentence that reflects the severity of your actions." Michael stood with his shoulders slumped, finally understanding that his choices had consequences he could not manipulate or escape. Jennifer, sentenced separately to 10 years, had already been transported to begin serving her sentence. Their criminal enterprise was officially over. But as I watched my son being led away in handcuffs, I felt something I hadn't expected. Not satisfaction, but a profound sadness for everything that had been lost. Not just the money Michael had stolen, but the family trust that could never be fully rebuilt. The relationship with my grandchildren that would forever be complicated by what their father had done. And the years of my life that had been consumed by this battle for justice. Emma sat beside me in the courtroom, now 26 years old, and struggling to understand how her father had become the kind of person who could commit such calculated cruelty against his own mother. Her younger brother Jake, now 17, had refused to attend the sentencing. The family Michael claimed to be protecting had been destroyed by his attempt to steal from it. "Grandma," Emma whispered as we left the courthouse, "I need you to know that I understand why you did this. Dad left you no choice. Thank you, sweetheart. But I also need you to understand that there were no good options. Every choice I made came with a price, including the choice to see this through to the end." The price had indeed been substantial. The legal battle had consumed almost a year of my life and cost hundreds of thousands of dollars in attorney fees, even though most of the stolen money had been recovered. The stress had taken a physical toll that I was still feeling. Most significantly, the public nature of the case had made our family's private tragedy a matter of public record and community gossip. But there had also been unexpected benefits. The case had attracted attention from other families dealing with similar situations, and I had been contacted by dozens of elderly people who were facing financial manipulation from their own children. Several had asked me to help them understand their legal options, and I had found myself informally returning to the practice of law for the first time in 5 years. More importantly, the prosecution had set legal precedents that would make it easier for future victims of elder abuse to seek justice. The federal charges had sent a message that this type of family financial crime would be taken seriously by law enforcement, not dismissed as a private family matter. Margaret had been right. By refusing to show mercy, I had helped protect other elderly people who might face similar betrayals from their own families. But the most significant change in my life had been personal rather than legal. The process of fighting for my independence and dignity had reminded me of who I really was, not just as Harold's wife or Michael's mother, but as Penelope Harrington, the woman who had built a successful legal career and never lost a case that mattered. 3 months after Michael's sentencing, I made a decision that would have seemed impossible a year earlier. I reopened my law practice, specializing in elder law and family financial crimes. At 68 years old, I was starting a new chapter of my career, one focused on helping other people who found themselves in situations similar to what I had experienced. My first client was a 74-year-old man whose daughter had been systematically stealing from his retirement accounts while convincing him he was too confused to manage his own finances. The parallels to my own situation were striking. But this time, I was on the other side of the equation. Not the victim, but the advocate. "Mr. Peterson," I told him during our initial consultation, "what your daughter is doing to you is not just morally wrong, it's criminal. And you have more power to fight back than she wants you to believe." The case was complex and emotionally difficult, but we won a complete victory. The daughter was prosecuted, the stolen money was recovered, and Mr. Peterson regained control of his life and finances. More importantly, he rediscovered his sense of self-worth and independence. "Mrs. Harrington," he told me after the case was resolved, "you didn't just get my money back, you gave me back my dignity." That became the mission of my new practice, not just recovering stolen assets, but helping elderly victims rediscover their strength and refuse to be defined by other people's perception of their limitations. The work was emotionally demanding, but it was also deeply satisfying in ways I hadn't expected. Every victory against financial predators felt like a vindication of my decision to fight Michael rather than accept his manipulation. Every client who regained their independence validated my belief that age and grief don't make someone helpless unless they choose to accept that definition. A year after Harold's death, I visited his grave on the anniversary. This time, I wasn't the confused, isolated widow who had been prevented from attending his funeral. I was a successful attorney with a thriving practice, a woman who had fought for justice and won, someone who had transformed personal tragedy into a mission to help others. "Harold," I said, placing fresh roses on his headstone, "I kept my promise. Michael didn't get away with it, and I found a way to make sure what happened to us doesn't happen to other families." Standing in that cemetery, I reflected on everything that had changed since Michael had locked me in my bedroom 18 months earlier. He was now serving the 6th year of his sentence, with 12 years remaining. Jennifer was in a different federal prison, serving her own time. The money they had stolen was back where it belonged, and the business Harold had built was operating successfully under new management. But more importantly, I had discovered that being a 68-year-old widow didn't mean accepting victimization or manipulation. It meant having 6 decades of experience and knowledge to draw upon when facing challenges that would have overwhelmed a younger person. The legal system had worked exactly as it was designed to work. Justice had been served. The innocent had been protected, and the guilty had been punished proportionately to their crimes. Yet as I drove home from the cemetery that day, I found myself thinking not about victory or justice, but about the complexity of human relationships and the way that family love can sometimes become twisted into something destructive and cruel. Michael was still my son, even though he was also a convicted felon. That relationship would always be complicated by what he had done, but it hadn't been erased by his imprisonment. Someday, probably years from now, we would have to figure out what kind of relationship was possible between a mother and a son who had tried to destroy her life. Emma and Jake were rebuilding their own lives, supported by scholarship funds I had established to ensure that their parents' crimes didn't destroy their educational opportunities. They visited me regularly, and we were slowly reconstructing the family bonds that Michael and Jennifer had tried to exploit. But perhaps the most important lesson I had learned was this: when someone tries to convince you that you're too old, too confused, or too emotional to protect yourself, that's exactly when you need to fight back with everything you have. Because sometimes the people who claim to love you are the ones who are most dangerous to you. And sometimes the only way to preserve that love, or whatever worthy parts of it might still exist, is to refuse to let it be used as a weapon against you. At 70 years old, I was living proof that it's never too late to rediscover your strength, defend your dignity, and build something meaningful from the ashes of betrayal. Harold would have been proud.